Welcome to the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse podcast. I am your host, Amy Helms. Each week, you will hear from experts across the country and even world speak to you on recovering from narcissistic abuse and even how to manage these relationships. You will also hear some periodic solo episodes on how to manage these relationships and what recovery is like. It is my hope that you will leave each episode with some renewed hope that you can and will beat this. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. I'm Amy Helms, your host, and today we have Jill Lewis. Jill is a licensed social worker, certified eating disorder specialist and supervisor, and a certified psychogroup specialist, has a practice in Atlanta. She believes that everyone can have a healthy relationship with their body. She does prioritize the anti-diet approach and practices a weight inclusivity model in every individual and group therapy session. She practices with an authentic connection-focused approach and prompts change. Many clients say that working with Jill has helped them truly begin to unearth their relationship with themselves, food, family, and connection to others. Welcome, Jill. I'm so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Let's just start off with something simple. You've been in practice many years. You have a lot of experience. And you work with eating disorders, which we know come hand in hand with trauma. And maybe give a little bit of insight into what you see in your practice.
Sure. Well, I started my practice in New York City, and I do still have a significant part of it there. And some of my team also works with people in New York. So over the years, I've been doing this a little over 15 years. We've noticed sort of the correlation, obviously, between trauma, eating disorders, family dynamics. And one of the things that constantly happens is that people are using food to cope, whether it's they are restricting food because they feel scared of their emotions and their feelings, so they choose to avoid food, or they're using food and they compulsively overeat, or what we call binge eat. Either way, they're using food to self-soothe so they don't have to tolerate the emotions that are surfacing. And one of the things that we do is to really help them build an intrapersonal connection and an interpersonal connection. So helping to find those ways that it feels very hard to tolerate emotions and feelings, seek them out, identify them, notice that they won't feel swarmed by them, and how can they also nourish themselves and tolerate being in their bodies at the same time. So that is the gist of what I see. What I just want to clarify very much so that most people see around eating disorders is most people think that an eating disorder is only restrictive and that only someone with anorexia has an eating disorder. And actually, those with anorexia are the smallest subset of our population. Those struggling with binge eating disorders, and typically those living in larger bodies or even medium-sized bodies, are actually the highest percentage of eating disorders, but often get overlooked and missed because they're not in this emaciated frame. So that's just something at my practice we like to really look at. We cater to those who are binging or typically living in larger bodies, and making sure that they also don't get missed in this process.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I know stats change, but I'm a stat nerd. Isn't it like 7% of people with eating disorders are actually underweight?
No, actually, I think it's significantly lower. I think it's around the 2 to 3%.
Yeah, because it's really low people that the societal perception of people with eating disorders is actually underweight. It's exactly the opposite. You can't even look at someone and say, oh, they're an eating disorder underweight. It's the opposite. Most of my patients you would never know.
You would never know. That's why we really try to focus on, it's not about what someone looks like, because you absolutely cannot tell what is going on for someone. And this is just a random example that just popped into my head. I'm sure most of us have heard about Twitch, who was the dancer that recently committed suicide, who I deeply loved. No one would have known. Right. So that's a quintessential example of someone who was truly struggling, And by an outward appearance, no one would know. So there's no way to make a judgment by looking at someone to know, A, what they're going through, but specifically around an eating disorder, because there's all this other stuff that's hidden and blocked. It is not cookie cutter, and it does not look one way. And it is not just a white upper middle class female. That was a long, long time ago, past research. Now it involves all genders, all sizes, all colors, all shapes, everyone.
Right. And now with narcissism, we talk about gaslighting. We see medical gaslighting where, oh, you're fine, you're a certain weight, or, men don't get this, you don't get, you go on and on. But a lot of people have severe medical gaslighting when they actually mention, I need help with this.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also part of the thing is that even when I live in a larger body, if I go in for a medical procedure, even just to see my doctor and they weigh me, and I really want to know, why do they need to weigh me? Right. And then there's all these rationale and reasons that actually are false and untrue, but make us as the patient at the time feel like we're doing something wrong by advocating for ourselves and simply being curious about our own medical need. And that has happened to me and my clients and colleagues way too often, about that our opinion and our voice can't matter, and someone else knows about what we need more than what we need. And so in that, we feel crazy. And that is the whole gaslighting experience.
You talk about coping with the eating. How's that coping?
Can you clarify the question? When you say coping, as in what I was
with earlier when you talk about like the eating and all that, because I know, but just for listeners and your expertise.
Absolutely. So I'll give kind of examples because I'm an example person, and I find that breaks things down a little bit more. So something very simple. Let's say your parents are fighting and we don't know if they're separated. We don't know what's going on, but there is fighting. And so somehow I feel unstable in how I feel in my family home. So to me, I might feel anxious. I might feel scared. I might feel worried. I might feel resentful. I'm probably very confused. And when those feelings surface, they feel too hard to manage. So instead, most of my clients will go find food, and either they won't eat any, they'll just avoid, so they can focus on their hunger rather than the emotions that they're holding on to, or they're going to eat excessive amounts of food so they don't have to think about the feelings that they're sitting with and tolerating. And some people then obviously get very, very full, and they use compensatory activities to get rid of the fullness, whether that's by throwing up or by exercising or by laxatives, none of which are healthy, nor do any of us recommend. So that's the process around the food. Our feelings and our emotions we feel like they're going to be too much. We feel like they're going to feel swarmed. So we do something to block them. And that is where the food or the exercise and the preoccupation with body comes in. If I am consumed enough with either not eating, when my next meal is, what I'm going to get, or how much exercise I've done and how tired physically my body is, I don't have to deal with the actual emotional piece that I'm sitting with that feels too painful to have to tolerate.
Right. And that's when, they don't realize that's what they're doing. They think I'm not eating, but it's really that noise that's preoccupying.
Correct. And we always say, and if anyone were to call me and walk into my office, I'm never going to take your eating disorder from you. That's not my goal. Because I think we have to also really understand I'm very psychodynamic and very relational. So constantly looking at the past and understanding the present. So to understand, this eating disorder served a purpose. You needed it. You had to use it. So there was reasons that you felt like you couldn't tolerate your emotions. Your environment wasn't safe. Maybe your emotions were too big. Maybe if you communicated them, someone reacted to you unsafely. And so for all of those things, you needed the eating disorder. And now you're at a space where it's no longer serving you. So my goal isn't to take it. My goal is to help you understand and tolerate emotions so that you can have a different response the next time the painful or joyful stuff comes up. We don't need to use food to mask the emotions. You can actually sit in the experience.
Now, we just talked about the function of a behavior with Tracy, the previous episode, and this is exactly the same thing. And I know in my personal experience, I had anorexia, and I learned it wasn't safe to be in a healthy body or I would get hurt. And when I got healthy, I would be hurt again. And so I really didn't understand the process, but it became coupled with a healthy body means you're going to be hurt.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
until I was healthy enough to move on and to leave a relationship, it happened again. And that was my experience. So,
Yeah. And very similar. And I'm so
mhm,
glad that you just shared that because it is so common, right? Is that even the one of the worst things, like I hate this, is when someone has, if they were living in a smaller body and they did gain weight because they were finally nourishing themselves, and people come in and say, "You look so healthy." Healthy is like a death word to many of my clients,
mhm,
right? And what that also says is someone living in a larger body, maybe they also changed their pattern of relationship with food. And maybe by default, they lost some weight, not on purpose, no intentional dieting. But if binging does cease and a healthy relationship transpires, they could lose weight, and someone coming back and complimenting them on the weight loss. So that means that the body they lived in before wasn't worthwhile and
mhm,
wasn't valued. So only until they shifted and changed it did it mean that their body was valuable. And that is something we really work towards changing, is not putting emphasis on the actual body, is on the nourishment, the ability to tolerate, the ability to show up, to communicate, to build relationships, rather than someone's gained weight or lost weight. And how does that, what's that measure? Does nothing.
mhm. Yeah, because then it becomes a measure of, for the person that loses weight and gets that compliment, well, what happens if life changes and I become that other person? Will you leave me or abandon me?
Yeah,
Which is
constantly.
scary.
Scary and very, very common.
So,
Yes.
how do you work with people that are coming to you with trauma and in these relationships or just out of these relationships? I know you offer individual and group therapy, but you know when they're just in the traumatic stress or just out, and what's your process?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I work really psychodynamically and relationally. I base so much of my, and I'll explain what that means. And I base so much of my work on enactments. So basically, the psychodynamic world is looking, as I said, at your past to understand your present. So we often joke that we might marry our mom or marry our dad or something familiar, and we get stuck
Mhm.
in an enactment. And what that means is we've played out patterns over and over again in our lives, but now they're not serving us, but we did them out of familiarity, out of comfort, and out of safety.
Mhm.
So one of the first things that I do is I simply build rapport and trust, and I be a very authentic, safe person for you. So no trauma, nothing big is ever happening at the beginning, because that would be an enactment on harm for that client. You're going to walk in here and I'm going to make you be vulnerable and spill your guts right away in a space that you don't feel safe. So I cannot do that, because that would be playing out their same patterns. So what I am going to do is build rapport, show up beautifully and gracefully, and be in the process with them. And so the way I work relationally, which many people aren't don't always know how to navigate, is I always share my emotional reactions to my clients. Not a disclosure, but an emotional reaction. If someone's crying and I might cry with them, or I'll say, "Oh, I feel so close to you now that you've put that out there." Or if someone has come in really angry and aggressive, I'm going to really say, "I have to be honest, I'm feeling really distant from you right now. I think you want to be closer with me, but you're not because of the way you're speaking, and I'm feeling more distant." So what that does is I'm modeling what I'm sure their relationships and their people feel like outside of our session, but no one's willing to say, and I'm going to come in and say them. And so that slowly starts to build safety and trust. And then we can start touching on big T trauma, little t trauma, and how they ended up here in the first place. But I'm very gentle. I ask permission. I had a client the other day, and she had a pretty severe rape back in April. And slowly I said, "Is it okay if I go a bit further?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Can I go a bit further?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Are we done for today?" She said, "Yes." You kind of read it on her face. So I'm also constantly checking in, similar to what they actually do in a rape assessment. And once someone's going through that, is always asking for permission, so that we're not enacting and playing out patterns over and over again, that our clients know we are here to do work, but we're also here to make sure they feel safe in that process, and we don't go too far, too fast, too quick.
I think that's key too. And you're letting them say yes because they have permission to say no as well.
Exactly. Exactly. The
Mm-hmm.
only part I will throw is that sometimes I'm going to gently nudge a tiny bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the other part there is like, okay, I'm getting worked up. This is feeling emotional, or I'm accessing painful feelings. I don't want them to totally shut down. So the goal is to help tolerate them in our sessions and then be able to close up enough that they can leave. And so I'm asking for permission to also give them an ability to like sift through their own internal feelings compass and say, okay, this is really hard, but I think I can do more. I think I can do it. So that's another piece is yes, we also want to protect, but also allow them to push up against that boundary just a tiny bit to practice.
Right, because we want to always leave a session where the person's regulated and not agitated. Otherwise, you're re-traumatizing.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. So, no, that's great. And it seems like you're talking about like modeling a healthy relationship.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. And that speaks to, so I'm a
yeah.
trained group psychotherapist. I
Mhm.
love group work. I have been running a Monday night mixed eating disorder interpersonal process group actually for 12 years. And I am stepping out of it in 3 weeks and starting another interpersonal process group. We have a few at our practice,
Mhm.
but I very much believe that although individual, family, couples is so necessary, what happens in group work is so deeply powerful because we actually get to see how clients show up when there are other people in the room. And so those are moments to help our clients work on distress tolerance, have healthy communication. How do they withdraw like they do when they're at home? So it plays out so many more dynamics. So we're looking at transference to so many different people. So those are the ways that I really do help model and help people to show up and navigate their interpersonal relationships. And if I could recommend a group for everybody, I would. Like literally everyone on the planet could be in a group.
So who are your groups for?
So I said the Monday night group is an eating disorder group that I'm stepping out of. And a week after it ends, I'm starting just a general 18 plus interpersonal process group. It's forming beautifully, and I'm really excited. I also run a 40 plus interpersonal process group, which is basically for those, as I said, 40 plus who are in a similar stage of life, right? We are either kids, divorce, struggles in partnerships, struggles in job, career, as opposed to being with other college kids who are just starting out, their career. This gives people a place and a space to be in a very similar situation as others. Our actual practice, I don't run them. We run 2 groups for those living in larger bodies because we do specialize in working with larger body clients. We have 2 groups with that. We have an ARFID group. And for those that don't know, ARFID is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. It is an eating disorder, but it does not have anything to do with the preoccupation with the body. So the ARFID people get a little kind of outcasted from the eating disorder world because they don't fit in, but they fit in. So we recently started an ARFID support group just so they have a place to go. It's not an interpersonal group, but just so they have similar experiences to others. And we're working on starting a Black women safe space group. And we have a second mixed eating disorder interpersonal process group on another night.
And do you have those both in Atlanta and New York?
The groups are in Atlanta, but most of them are hybrid and have people from New York. And the ARFID group can have anyone from anywhere because it's just a support group. It's not a therapy group. But yeah, we have mixed. I set up my office so that we could do hybrid. We have large TVs so everyone could be seen. So yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. Are you seeing differences with, rates of anything between the 2 states? Because we get asked questions about, are you noticing, more of, you know, narcissistic abuse? Are you noticing more of the trauma or anything? Do you think it's cultural? Do you think it's this? But you have a good perception because these are 2 totally different states.
Very different states and different cultures. What I will say is when I first moved my practice back to Atlanta 6 years ago, it's a much more behavioral city, whereas New York is, there's multiple institutes. I was trained there and in an analytic training program and in my group therapy training. So Atlanta's much more behavioral very smart. Like the Atlanta community is also brilliant. I don't know if I had like some judgment that maybe it wouldn't be, but it's so brilliant and there's so many opportunities, but it's definitely more behavioral. So bringing in my style, which I was trained in New York, which everyone was very cool with in New York, because it's definitely more liberal there. That part was harder. As far as the rest of things, I do think in general, New York's a little more open and liberal about things, but overall, I haven't seen such significant differences with trauma or with narcissism or with borderline. Like they all surface and show up everywhere. But yeah, that was the main difference.
Because a lot of times people say, well, with South Carolina, Georgia, the southern states, especially with like eating and respond to things, it's just what we do. So, at Newark, and I was trained in Chicago.
Okay.
So it's just curious, how it differs across the country.
And what I will say is I'm Jewish and I work a lot with the Jewish community. 4 of my 5 practitioners, our associates are Jewish. So what your statement is what people say a lot, right? Oh, well, like we're just Jewish, like food's everywhere. We just like eat. That's a thing. And so that is something, as you said, that I kind of forgot that is very cultural, at least in my world. And I do think a little bit in the South, many people don't go to therapy. Therapy is much more taboo in Georgia. I think Atlanta is a little bit different than Georgia, hence, blues and reds that have happened in our state. And so I think when you kind of get a little more into the outskirts of Georgia, yeah, things shift a bit. But yeah, I did remember that about the Jewish comment that people say we just eat. That's our job.
Yeah, we were talking before the podcast, and you did make a comment about like, there's one group of people that you don't do group therapy with.
Yeah. So yeah, there's 1 1/4 kind of sections, but if someone comes and interviews and there is either a hint of narcissism or clearly they have narcissistic personality disorder, they're unfortunately not welcome in group, because the whole purpose of group is interpersonal connection. And someone who has true narcissistic personality disorder doesn't have an ability to connect and cannot see outside of themselves. And there was one time where I was put in a group to lead it, and there was a narcissist in the group. And honestly, we spoke about this earlier. I was feeling gaslit like every session. I couldn't, my points wouldn't be heard. And I was like, wait, I'm a really good communicator. I'm very grounded and I'm feeling like I'm feeling crazy. And so I realized, and it was my first or second year of leading a group. I spoke to my supervisor and we had to figure out a way to ask the client to leave. We basically told them they graduated. And so they felt like they were on top of the world because we made it about their success. And they left very happily because, they did so much better than everyone, of course. But yeah, anyone who struggles with narcissism, I won't let them in group, because that is going to hinder and it's going to hold the group hostage. Because there's going to be no ability for anyone to penetrate or interact with them. And that's not the purpose of group. The purpose is connection.
So what signs would you see in an interview, or have you seen something since?
Yeah. I mean, extreme preoccupation, obviously, with themselves and their successes and the way that they show up in the world. There's a bit of like this air of this ego part that is, when they're talking, I want to be able to describe it well. When they're talking, it's just like how I've done things or how I've shown up, right? There's no bringing in other people and other relationships. Or if they bring in other relationships, the reason things don't work or the reason things haven't been successful is there's no ownership. It's always about someone else, how they've done it, how someone has always harmed them, hurt them, and an inability to see that they could have any contribution in a two-way relationship, which is what a relationship is. So no ownership, no attunement. And my quintessential thing is I'm constantly asking about emotions. And if someone cannot tolerate, ask, or is so defensive that they couldn't even have an emotion, as in, when you're talking and I'm hearing that many of your relationships have not worked out, I'm sensing maybe there might be sadness or disappointment. I'm curious about the feelings. I might have to feed that. Why would I be sad? I'd be so much better without that person. That person didn't hurt me. I wouldn't need them. So I'm not really sure why you think I would be sad right now. I don't connect to that. So to me, it's a complete dismissal of an awareness, and that person's a no-go from my group. And honestly, someone I wouldn't want to interact with in general.
No, good description.
Thanks.
So people that might be in a relationship like this, or, interacting someone, what should, what other things should they be looking out for? Because I mean, you're a therapist, I'm a therapist, we know how to do the screenings, but what are some general, you know, small talk questions or some just things they could observe just to watch out for?
Yeah. I think the first thing is if you, as a non-narcissist, can recognize that you have relationships, but one relationship feels constantly like you're a bit crazy, or that you're doing something wrong, or that you don't understand, that to me is a great sign. Maybe it's a boss at work and you're like, wait a minute, I have beautiful relationships. And every time I have this encounter, I feel crazy. And so that would be to me a telltale sign is if you are lucky and fortunate enough to have other relationships that you feel seen or validated or connected to, and
Mhm.
there's somewhere else, that would be a sign, right? Feeling crazy, feeling very confused, being questioning your own moral compass, your own ability to communicate what you have said and how you've said it. If you're constantly questioning that, please pay attention to that. And one of my biggest things is that most narcissists by default are playing a victim, but make another person have to be an extreme people pleaser and accommodator. So if you notice you are bending over backwards, constantly trying to accommodate this other human, make sure that they don't feel hurt, that they are part of something, that they don't feel dismissed, that they're included really nicely, that is also some information. If a person is not coming back and saying, hey, listen, you don't need to
Mhm.
jump through hoops just to like come see me, like I'll make it work. Okay, fine. But if someone constantly makes it about you, what you're doing wrong, and how you are not showing up and how you are not doing enough, to me, those are very big signs.
And I like that you brought up the example of a boss, because
Mhm.
we can be experiences from companies, from bosses, co-workers, companies, a lot of different places. It doesn't have to just come from one person.
Correct.
If we feel like we're being doing one thing one time and it's okay, but then the very next time it's the exact same thing, but we're treated like we're idiots, then it's probably a them problem, not a us problem.
Correct. And the hard part with so many of my clients specifically is if they are raised by a narcissistic parent, they lose themselves. And then 90% of the time, they typically find a narcissist as a partner. And then they're like, how did I get here? Like, why would I have done that? But that's what
Mm.
you were taught. That's what you knew. You felt like the way relationships work is to take care of another person, is to accommodate, is to give up completely of yourself to make sure the other person feels
Mm.
big and held and tall and powerful. And you're supposed to feel small in that experience. And that is what I see most often is that they had this family dynamic that created this. And then as an enactment, they played it out, ended up in it again because they don't know any other way to be. They're often magnets for people to show up in that experience. I'm thinking of one particular client, and she was literally a magnet for narcissistic
Mhm.
folk. They could like find her. Yeah.
Yeah, and it can
Yeah.
also, be raised by the perfect family, and life experiences change it. Just those people pleasing people.
Absolutely. And usually there's something has happened along the way, even if it's like, yeah, a boss or something that most of it just doesn't make sense. There's something that
Mhm.
feels off, but we're not really sure what it is because it's very covert. That's the other piece.
Mhm.
There's so much covert narcissism that goes on that it's so subtle. We often don't pick up on it until we're like knee deep. And then it's much more hard to extricate because you're like, how did I even get here? So I think that's another piece to recognize is it's hard often to pick up because I don't know if you'd agree with this, but this is also my take in a lot of ways. Most narcissists are very suave and debonair and like are great with
Mhm.
language and like, kind of give you a little bit of a rope. And so it's like, or maybe they do apologize as an abuser
Mhm.
does. It's like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry that that happened. I don't know if they'd apologize, but they probably wouldn't apologize, but they would finagle and make it feel like they took
Mhm.
responsibility. And then you're like, oh, okay, they're not so bad. And then if you go back and think, you're like, oh, well, they actually never took responsibility. They never apologized, but you're already in it that it feels very confusing.
Right. It might be, I'm sorry you dot, dot,
You
dot, made me, or I'm sorry,
you
I hurt
made
your
me.
feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
Tell,
you made
yeah. Tell about covert narcissism. What's the difference?
So I find it's, as I said, it's the real subtle ways that we don't realize, right?
Mhm.
I have another client and her mom would constantly say, well, I feel if you loved me more, you would bring the grandkids up. If you loved me and cared about me more, you would want to spend more time with me. So it's pulling on this idea of love and connection and and support. And so you feel like, oh my God, if I did love her more, or if I did love, I would show up and do all these things. Like, oh my gosh, do I not love enough? As opposed to blatantly someone saying to you, like, you're not worth it or you're not good enough or whatnot. I don't know if that would be specific language, but that the covert, subtle piece underneath and manipulating it in that way. And then you, as the person, feel like you have not done enough or you don't care enough. And then you shift your pattern and change because of these little subtleties and the undertone of what is going on.
Right. I work with a lot of college students being close to university, and I see that a lot with, coercive behaviors. If you love me, you would do this.
Yep. Yeah. So that to me feels like the covert part when
Mm-hmm.
you can't tease out and you genuinely feel like you are doing something wrong by the way that someone has said something to you, and they're pulling on you from the relationship, because that's the part. If you feel pulled by the relationship, then you are more likely to continue in the relationship.
So those mind games, or
Yes.
everyone else is, for their partners, or it's even in
Yep.
high school, it's prom night. Don't you love me?
Correct.
Yeah.
Literally all the time. Yes. That's a great example too. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Do you have any final advice? We've talked about eating disorders, bodies, processing groups, narcissism.
Yeah.
Any final piece of advice or tip, words of wisdom?
Yeah, I'm always of the proponent of really trying to listen to your gut. And oftentimes I say that to people because their gut has given them the information. Like that spidey sense thing went off and they've recognized it, but they ignore it because they've been taught to ignore it. So what I throw out there is really try to listen to it. And it's okay if you hurt someone else, not physically, but if in your process someone else gets hurt, that's okay. I often hear that, well, they might get hurt. Okay, so they are not allowed to get hurt at your expense and you get hurt to protect them. It's not how it works.
That's a them problem. Yeah.
Correct. That shouldn't be part of the thing you have to negotiate in a relationship. And so I think it's really paying attention to your gut instinct and really trying to tease out healthy relationships where you are feeling safe and heard and listen to that. And then you can check in. Hey, my partner just said this and that didn't feel good. Can I be curious about it with someone else? So please try to listen to your gut. Never be afraid to ask for help and to be curious. And if you are looking for a therapist or a group, it doesn't have to be the first one. I joke that it's like dating. We do want to find the best fit. You're allowed to make phone calls. And people are like, well, I don't want to waste $200 on a session. Okay, so you're going to show up, just stay stuck with someone like an enactment of a relationship just because you don't want to keep trying to find a good fit. $200 two times in the scheme of the world to find someone who feels like a good fit for you, can understand and relate to you, is a drop in the bucket based on the work that you're going to do.
I mean, the rapport is the biggest indicator of outcome.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So I also encourage people to join groups. I find the best way that my clients have healed. Individual is phenomenal, but that is your next step of how to navigate the world interpersonally, working on communication, assertiveness, taking up space, healthy conflict, distress tolerance, all of that comes up in group very, very naturally. And that's how we want to show up in the world.
I love that. We talked about both being analytical, if it doesn't make sense, logic doesn't apply in these relationships. So that's a huge thing to pay attention to.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you online? It'll be linked in here, but just so you can put it out there.
Yeah, we're at jlewisTherapy.com. It's JLEWISTHERAPY.com. People joke sometimes it looks like Jewish therapy. It is not Jewish therapy. It's J. Lewis Therapy, even though we're all Jewish and are proud of it. And on there has our links to sessions, groups, workshops, etc.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I think our listeners will gain a lot from it.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. We hope you were able to leave with some renewed hope. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, give us a review, head to the show notes for more information on the things that we highlighted. And there's also a link to the website for a course that we offer on the same topic, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Thank you again, and please tune in to the next episode.